"Get out of my house," I said to my own son, while my wife was still lying on the dining room floor, clutching her shoulder. Snorts. He looked at me as if I had lost my mind. His wife looked offended. My 7-year-old granddaughter was crying so hard she could barely breathe. And the one person who should have stood between his mother and the woman who had just shoved her into a wall looked me straight in the eye and said, "Dad, it was just an accident." That was the moment I realized I no longer had a problem with my daughter-in-law. I had a problem with my son. Please, before we continue, make sure to subscribe to the channel and let us know in the comments where you're listening from today. My name is Richard Donovan. I'm 69 years old, and I spent 34 years as chief building inspector for the city before retiring. My entire career was built on one principle. When something becomes dangerous, you don't wait for a second collapse. You stop it immediately. I just never imagined the building I'd someday have to condemn would be my own family. That evening was supposed to celebrate my wife Helen's 67th birthday. We'd been married for 43 years, and she deserved a quiet night surrounded by the people she'd spent a lifetime loving. Our son, Michael, arrived just after 6:00 with his wife Vanessa and their daughter Sophie. The house felt warm. Candles glowed across the dining table. Sophie proudly handed Helen a birthday card she'd made herself, and for a little while, I believed this would become one of those ordinary family memories worth keeping. Vanessa even seemed unusually pleasant, complimenting the meal and thanking Helen for inviting them. Looking back now, that was the calm before everything broke apart. During dinner, Vanessa picked up an old serving platter sitting beside the birthday cake. It wasn't valuable. The glaze had faded years ago, and one corner had been carefully repaired decades earlier. Helen smiled when she saw it in Vanessa's hands. "My mother gave me that before she passed away," she said softly. Vanessa studied it for another moment before giving a short laugh. "Honestly, Helen, some things should stay in the past. It makes the whole table look outdated." The room grew noticeably quieter. Helen tried to smile through the remark and gently reached for the platter, hoping to change the subject. Michael lowered his eyes to his plate without saying a word. Sophie stopped talking altogether. I expected my son to defend his mother. Instead, he quietly sipped his drink while Vanessa continued criticizing the decorations, the furniture, and finally the house itself, joking that it felt more like a museum than a family home. Helen never answered back. She simply stood to carry another serving dish toward the kitchen, determined not to let one unpleasant conversation ruin the evening. Then, everything happened faster than thought. Vanessa stood at the same moment. There was a sudden movement, a sharp bump, and Helen crashed backward into the dining room wall. The serving dish exploded across the floor. Sophie screamed. I reached Helen before anyone else. She was holding her shoulder, her face frozen in shock more than pain. I turned toward Michael, waiting for him to ask if his mother was hurt or confront his wife about what had just happened. Instead, he glanced briefly at Vanessa and quietly said, "Dad, it was probably just an accident." I looked at my son, then at the bruise already beginning to form beneath Helen's sleeve. In 34 years of inspecting unsafe buildings, I'd learned that the greatest danger was never the first crack. It was the people who insisted the crack wasn't there. I pointed toward the front door and ordered them to leave. Minutes later, their car disappeared into the night. The birthday candles were still burning when I walked into my office, unlocked the bottom drawer of an old filing cabinet, and wrapped my hand around a worn brass key attached to a thick property folder. Michael hadn't thought about that folder in 6 years. I hadn't expected to open it again either. But as I placed it on my desk and slowly lifted the cover, I realized my son's silence had just triggered consequences neither he nor Vanessa had ever imagined. The morning after Helen's birthday felt strangely ordinary, and somehow that made everything worse. Sunlight filled the kitchen exactly as it had every other Sunday. Coffee brewed. Birds landed on the fence outside. The world behaved as though nothing had happened. Only the bruise beneath Helen's sleeve reminded me that one family dinner had quietly changed the direction of our lives. She insisted on keeping her weekly volunteer shift at the public library. "I'm not going to let one bad evening keep me inside," she said with a gentle smile. I admired her strength, but I also recognized something she refused to admit. She wasn't going because she felt strong. She was going because she didn't want anyone to worry about her. After she left, I locked the front door, walked into my office, and unlocked the bottom drawer of an old steel filing cabinet. Inside sat a small metal box I hadn't opened in years. Resting on top was a worn brass key attached to a faded tag with one address written in black ink: Michael's house. At least, that's what everyone in the family called it. Legally, it had never belonged to him. Years earlier, when Michael and Vanessa wanted to buy their first home, the bank declined their mortgage application. Their income was inconsistent, their savings were limited, and the lender considered the risk too high. I could have simply written them a check, but I believed gifts often solved today's problem while creating tomorrow's entitlement. Instead, I purchased the property myself and asked Evelyn Brooks, my attorney, to prepare a structured lease-to-own agreement. The arrangement was simple. Michael's family could live in the house, build financial stability, and eventually purchase it under clearly defined terms. I wanted him to earn ownership, not inherit it through convenience. I opened the folder and slowly reviewed the agreement. Most pages contained payment schedules, maintenance obligations, insurance requirements, and routine legal language. Then I reached the section I'd been looking for. Section 8, Family Safety Provision. I remembered insisting that Evelyn include it, even though she questioned whether it was necessary. The clause stated that if the occupants created a credible threat to the physical or emotional safety of an immediate member of my family, I reserved the right to terminate the agreement with written notice. At the time, it had felt like nothing more than responsible planning. Now, those few paragraphs carried an entirely different weight. I read them once, then again. Every word remained as clear as the day I signed it. There was no uncertainty, no hidden interpretation, just responsibility waiting to be accepted. I picked up the phone and called Evelyn. She answered almost immediately. "Good morning, Richard. I wasn't expecting to hear from you on a Sunday." "I need you to review the Donovan property agreement," I said. She heard something in my voice because her tone changed instantly. "I'll pull it up now." I briefly described what had happened the previous evening, avoiding emotion and staying with the facts. Vanessa had shoved Helen. Helen had struck the wall. Michael had refused to acknowledge what happened. Evelyn listened without interrupting. When I finished, I heard the sound of a keyboard before she finally spoke. "I'm looking at Section 8. "So am I replied. Another few seconds passed. "The language is enforceable," she said calmly. "If you're asking whether the agreement allows termination under these circumstances, my answer is yes." I looked down at the brass key resting beside the folder. For years it had represented hope, a father's belief that helping his son build a future would strengthen the family. Now it represented something else entirely: boundaries. Evelyn asked the question I knew was coming. "Richard, have you made your decision?" I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I thought about Helen quietly leaving the house that morning without complaining once about the pain in her shoulder. I thought about Michael watching everything happen and choosing silence over truth. My decision had already been made before I opened the filing cabinet. I simply needed the law to confirm what my conscience already knew. "Yes," I said quietly. "Prepare the termination notice." Evelyn didn't try to change my mind. "I'll have the documents ready this afternoon." After the call ended, I closed the folder, locked the brass key back inside the metal box, and rested my hand on the cabinet for several seconds. Once the notice was prepared, there would be no pretending the birthday dinner had been a misunderstanding. The next move belonged to me, and I intended to make it before anyone else had the chance to rewrite what had happened in my home. Monday morning began with a single email from Evelyn Brooks. The subject line contained only 4 words: "Termination notice ready." I read every page twice before signing. 34 years as a building inspector had taught me that important decisions should never be made in anger. They should survive a second reading. This one did. The language was direct, professional, and impossible to misunderstand. Michael and Vanessa would have 30 days to vacate the property under the family safety provision of the agreement they had signed 6 years earlier. I signed my name, scanned the document, and sent it back to Evelyn without adding a single comment. Less than an hour later, she confirmed that a courier was already on the way. I placed the brass key back into the metal box, closed the lid, and walked out onto the wooden porch swing where Helen was watering the flower beds. She looked at me for a moment and quietly asked, "Is it done?" I nodded. She lowered her eyes, not because she disagreed, but because she understood there was no path back to the family we had before Saturday night. Neither of us spoke again. Around 11th year that morning, my phone rang. Michael. I let it ring twice before answering. "Dad, what is this?" There was no greeting, only confusion mixed with panic. "You received the notice," I replied calmly. "You're terminating the agreement?" "Yes." A long silence followed before he spoke again. "There has to be some mistake." I looked out across the backyard. "There isn't," he exhaled sharply. "Dad, you're throwing us out over one family argument." I didn't raise my voice. "No, Michael, I'm acting because your mother was no longer safe in my home." He immediately answered with the sentence I'd expected since Saturday. "Vanessa didn't mean to hurt her." I closed my eyes for a brief moment. "I'm not asking what Vanessa meant. I'm asking what happened." Another silence. Then he tried a different approach. "You know how emotional things became?" "I know exactly how they became," I replied. I was standing there. Before he could answer, another voice interrupted in the background. "Vanessa." A second later, the phone changed hands. "Richard," she said confidently, "this is completely unreasonable." Her tone carried more irritation than concern. "You can't destroy our family's future because people got upset during dinner." I waited. She continued speaking, filling the silence with explanations instead of accountability. Nobody wanted Helen to get hurt. Not once did she say the word sorry. Not once did she ask how Helen was feeling. Every sentence focused on the house, the agreement, or the inconvenience my decision had created for them. Finally, she said, "You're punishing Sophie, too." That was the first time either of them mentioned my granddaughter. Unfortunately, even that sounded less like concern and more like strategy. I answered quietly, "Sophie always has a place in our lives. This decision isn't about her." Vanessa laughed once without humor. "Then it's about revenge." "No," I replied. "It's about responsibility." She started arguing again, but I ended the call before the conversation could become another performance. During the rest of the afternoon, my phone rang repeatedly. Michael called 3 more times. 2 voicemails followed. One message asked me to reconsider. Another insisted everything had been exaggerated. Neither mentioned Helen's injury. Neither asked whether she was recovering. By evening, I realized something that hurt more than the shove itself. My son wasn't trying to understand why I had acted. He was trying to make the consequences disappear. That night after dinner, Helen handed me her phone. "Michael left me a voicemail," she said softly. I pressed play. His voice sounded exhausted. "Mom, please talk to Dad. Tell him we're sorry. We can't lose this house." The message ended there. No questions about her shoulder. No apology directed to her. Only fear of losing the property. Helen quietly took back her phone and stared at the dark screen. "Did you notice?" she whispered. I nodded slowly. "Yes." She looked toward the kitchen window, her expression filled more with sadness than anger. He never once asked if I was okay. Neither of us said another word. We didn't need to. For the first time since Michael was born, we both understood that the house had become more important to him than the woman who had spent a lifetime making every place he ever lived feel like home. 3 days passed without another phone call from Michael. The silence felt unusual, almost rehearsed. After listening to 7 voicemails that all revolved around the house, I had expected more arguments, more negotiations, more promises. Instead, nothing. Experience taught me that sudden silence rarely meant acceptance. It usually meant someone was preparing a different approach. Friday afternoon, Helen left for her regular volunteer shift at the public library. Before she walked out the door, I noticed her hesitate for the first time in years. "You'll be home around 4?" she asked. I smiled. "Closer to 3, Hust." She nodded and forced a small smile before leaving. That hesitation stayed with me long after she drove away. At 2:18 that afternoon, my phone rang. Helen. The moment I answered, I knew something was wrong. She wasn't crying. She wasn't shouting. She was whispering. "Richard," she said quietly. "Vanessa's here. I was already reaching for my car keys." "Are you inside?" "Yes. Stay there. I'm coming." I arrived at the library parking lot less than 10 minutes later. Helen stood near the entrance beside 2 volunteers. Across the sidewalk, Vanessa waited with her arms folded, wearing a perfectly tailored cream-colored suit that made her look more like a successful businesswoman than someone who had shoved her mother-in-law into a wall only days earlier. The moment she saw me, she smiled. It wasn't a warm smile. It was the smile of someone convinced they could still control the outcome. "Richard," she said pleasantly, "I'm glad you're here. I wanted to apologize." I looked at Helen before answering. She was standing completely still, but I noticed something I had never seen in 43 years of marriage. She was keeping her distance. My wife wasn't angry. She was cautious. That hurt more than the bruise ever could. "Say what you came to say," I replied. Vanessa turned toward Helen. "I felt terrible all week," she began. "Everything happened so fast. We were both emotional." There it was. Less than 20 seconds into her apology, responsibility had already become shared. Helen spoke softly. "You pushed me." Vanessa immediately shook her head. "No, Helen, we bumped into each other." I watched Helen's shoulders tense. She wasn't debating facts. She was reliving them. Vanessa took another small step forward. "I think everyone has exaggerated what happened. Families argue. People lose their balance. We shouldn't let one misunderstanding destroy everything." Helen instinctively stepped backward. It was only a single step, but it told me everything I needed to know. She wasn't stepping away from conflict. She was stepping away from fear. I moved between them before Vanessa could take another step. "This conversation is over." Vanessa looked at me with obvious frustration. "Richard, you're making this much bigger than it really is." "No," I answered calmly. "I'm refusing to make it smaller." Her expression hardened. The friendly tone disappeared almost instantly. "Do you have any idea what this is doing to Michael?" she demanded. I noticed she still hadn't asked Helen how her shoulder was healing. She hadn't apologized for the pain. She hadn't accepted responsibility for anything. Every sentence kept circling back to one subject: the consequences she and Michael were facing. The house was still the center of every conversation. "You could fix all of this today," she continued. "Just withdraw the termination notice." I looked directly at her. The only person who could have prevented that notice was the one who shoved my wife. For the first time, the smile vanished completely. Vanessa's voice became colder. "You're going to regret turning your own son against you." Before I could respond, another voice interrupted from behind us. "No," an older woman said firmly. "He'll regret not doing it sooner." We all turned at once. A woman in her early 60s was walking toward us from the parking lot. Vanessa's face changed immediately. The confidence disappeared, replaced by something I hadn't expected: uneasiness. The woman stopped beside me and looked directly at Vanessa. "You've been rewriting the truth your entire life," she said quietly. "It's time someone stopped believing you." Vanessa didn't say a word. She simply turned around, walked quickly to her car, and drove away without looking back. The older woman waited until the vehicle disappeared before extending her hand toward me. "My name is Patricia Cole," she said. "I'm Vanessa's sister, and I think you deserve to know who she's really been for the last 20 years." Patricia and I sat across from each other in a quiet coffee shop less than 15 minutes after Vanessa drove away. Helen stayed at the library with the volunteers, needing time to recover from the encounter. Patricia wrapped both hands around her untouched cup before finally speaking. "I've wanted to make this phone call for years," she said. "I just never imagined it would happen after someone in your family got hurt." I didn't interrupt. People carrying the truth for a long time rarely need questions. They need silence. Patricia stared through the window for several seconds before continuing. "Vanessa wasn't always like this. At least, that's what our parents kept telling themselves. Every outburst was explained away. Every apology was accepted. Every promise was treated like a fresh start. She looked back at me, until nobody could tell the difference between forgiveness and permission. I felt those words settle heavily in my mind. She reached into her handbag and placed a small envelope on the table. Inside were photocopies of police incident reports, court filings, and 2 old photographs. One showed a shattered dining room table. The other showed bruises on a man's forearm. "Who's this?" I asked. "Her former fiancé," Patricia answered quietly. "He never filed charges. He believed she would change." She slid another report toward me. This happened 3 years later. Different boyfriend. Same pattern. Different apology. I slowly turned each page. None of the incidents had resulted in serious criminal charges, but together they painted a picture that was impossible to ignore. Vanessa didn't lose control once. She followed a cycle. Tension, explosion, tears, excuses, reconciliation, then everything started again. "Did Michael know any of this?" I asked. Patricia nodded without hesitation. Not every detail, but enough. That answer surprised me more than anything I'd read. He told me she had a difficult personality. Patricia gave a tired smile. "Richard, a difficult personality doesn't leave people afraid to disagree with you." The cafe became very quiet. Outside, people walked past carrying shopping bags, completely unaware that my understanding of my own son was beginning to change. Patricia leaned closer. "There's something else you need to know." Her voice became even softer. "Vanessa wasn't the only one creating these disasters." I frowned. "What do you mean?" She hesitated for the first time. "Michael has a habit." I waited. "Whenever Vanessa starts getting angry, he rarely calms the situation. He quietly steps back and lets someone else absorb it." I didn't answer. She continued. "I've watched it happen at birthdays, holidays, even our father's funeral. He avoids conflict so completely that he sacrifices whoever happens to be standing closest." My chest tightened. Memories I hadn't questioned for years suddenly began fitting together differently. Family dinners where Michael disappeared into silence while arguments spread around him. Gatherings where Helen ended up comforting everyone else after Vanessa exploded. Times I'd blamed only Vanessa because Michael looked calm by comparison. Patricia reached into the envelope one final time and removed several printed emails. Vanessa showed these to me during one of their arguments. I recognized Michael's name immediately. They were messages he'd sent Vanessa over the years. Most looked ordinary at first glance until I noticed one strange detail. Nearly every email discussing money, refinancing, or gaining ownership of the house had been written within days of a major family conflict. Patricia pointed toward one of the dates. Whenever life became unstable, Michael started talking about the property. I stared at the pages in disbelief. The pattern repeated itself again and again. An argument, financial pressure, a conversation about transferring ownership sooner, another argument, another request. It wasn't proof that Michael planned any of it, but it proved something almost as painful. Every crisis became an opportunity. Patricia carefully gathered the papers back into the envelope before pushing it toward me. "Keep these," she said. "I don't want to protect this secret anymore." After she left, I remained alone in the cafe for nearly half an hour. When I finally returned home, I walked straight into my office and unlocked the metal box once again. The brass key rested exactly where I'd left it that morning. For 6 years, I believed that key represented my son's future. Now, I understood it represented something else entirely. Responsibility had been placed in Michael's hands long ago. Again and again, he had chosen the easier path instead. And for the first time since this nightmare began, I stopped seeing my son as a man trapped by Vanessa's behavior. I began seeing him as someone who had spent years allowing it whenever silence was more convenient than courage. The attorney's letter arrived the following Tuesday. Evelyn had warned me it was coming, but holding the envelope in my hands still felt different. Michael had officially hired legal counsel to challenge the termination of the property agreement. I carried the letter into my office, sat behind the same desk where I had signed the notice only days earlier, and read every page without interruption. The argument was exactly what Evelyn predicted. The incident involving Helen was described as an unfortunate family disagreement, not a legitimate safety concern. According to Michael's attorney, terminating a 6-year agreement over a single emotional evening was excessive and unreasonable. They wanted the notice withdrawn immediately. I folded the letter neatly and placed it beside the property folder. Facts hadn't changed just because someone hired a lawyer to describe them differently. An hour later, Evelyn arrived carrying her own stack of documents. She reviewed the demand letter, smiled faintly, and shook her head. "They're hoping emotion will outweigh the contract," she said. "It won't." She opened the agreement to Section 8 and tapped the page with her pen. "The clause isn't about punishment. It's about protecting family members from behavior that makes them unsafe. Helen's medical record, the photographs of her injury, and Vanessa's confrontation at the library all strengthen your position." I nodded. "So, we're staying the course?" "Absolutely," Evelyn replied. "If they want to fight, let them explain why your wife should have accepted being pushed in her own home." After she left, I locked the office and spent the rest of the afternoon repairing an old workbench in my garage. Whenever life became complicated, working with my hands helped clear my mind. I had just finished tightening the last bolt when I heard footsteps behind me. Michael stood quietly near the open garage door. He looked exhausted. His shirt was wrinkled, dark circles surrounded his eyes, and for the first time in weeks, he didn't arrive looking angry. He looked defeated. Neither of us spoke immediately. Finally, he broke the silence. "Can we talk?" I set the wrench down. "You're here now." He looked around the garage, his eyes lingering on the shelves where we'd once built model airplanes together when he was a boy. "I never thought we'd end up like this," he said. "Neither did I." He lowered his head. "Vanessa's moving into an apartment. I filed for divorce yesterday." The words hung in the air between us. Part of me felt relief. Another part wondered why it had taken my wife being shoved into a wall before my son finally reached that decision. "Why now?" I asked. Michael laughed bitterly. "Because I finally stopped believing the next apology would be different." He admitted that the arguments had grown worse for years. Sophie had started hiding in her bedroom whenever voices were raised. Friends had quietly stopped visiting. Every promise Vanessa made lasted only until the next disagreement. "I should have left a long time ago," he whispered. "Yes," I answered honestly. He nodded. There was no argument, no excuse, just quiet acceptance. For a moment, I thought we were finally having the conversation we'd needed years earlier. Then Michael looked directly at me. "Dad, if the divorce is happening, maybe we can find another solution with the house." The sentence landed harder than I expected. Everything suddenly made sense again. The lawsuit, the phone calls, the library confrontation. Even now, after admitting his marriage had failed, the conversation had found its way back to the property. I looked at him for several seconds before speaking. "Do you know what hurts the most?" He remained silent. "It isn't what Vanessa did." He frowned slightly. "It's that every road you take eventually leads back to this house." Michael looked away. He didn't deny it because he couldn't. "I'm trying to protect Sophie," he said quietly. "Then protect her," I replied. "But don't confuse protecting your daughter with keeping a house that was never yours." He rubbed both hands across his face. "I don't know how to start over. You start the same way every honest man does," I answered, "by accepting the consequences of the decisions that brought you here." The garage became completely silent. Finally, I picked up the brass key from the workbench where I had left it while organizing the property documents. I held it in my hand for a moment before closing my fist around it. "The agreement stands, Michael." His shoulders dropped. He gave a slow nod, not because he agreed, but because he finally understood I wasn't changing my mind. Without another word, he turned and walked down the driveway toward his car. I watched him leave until he disappeared around the corner. For the first time since this nightmare began, I realized losing the house would not be the hardest lesson my son was about to learn. The hardest lesson would be discovering that some doors never reopen simply because you're finally ready to knock. The conversation in my garage should have been the end of it. Michael had accepted that I wasn't changing my mind, and for the first time since Helen's birthday, I believed the legal process would simply run its course. I was wrong. 3 mornings later, Helen quietly pulled back the living room curtain and frowned. "Richard," she called softly. "Come here." A dark blue SUV was parked across the street with the engine off. At first, I thought it belonged to a neighbor's guest. Then Helen said, "It was there yesterday, too." We watched for several minutes. Nobody got out. Nobody knocked on the door. 20 minutes later, the vehicle slowly drove away. Helen tried to dismiss it, but I could see the uneasiness in her face. Over the next 4 days, the same SUV appeared 3 more times. Sometimes in the morning, sometimes just before sunset. It never stayed long. It never came close to the house, but it always stopped where whoever sat inside could see our front porch. Helen stopped sitting on the wooden porch swing in the evenings. She started checking the front window before leaving for the grocery store. One night, I found her making sure the back door was locked for the second time in less than an hour. That was the moment I realized this had stopped being about property. Fear had followed us home. On Saturday afternoon, we decided to have lunch at a small cafe a few miles from the library. We had barely finished eating when Helen's expression changed. She wasn't looking at me anymore. She was staring past my shoulder. I turned around. Vanessa was walking toward our table. She wore oversized sunglasses and carried an expensive handbag as though this were nothing more than a chance encounter. It wasn't. She stopped beside our table without asking if she could join us. "We need to talk," she said. I stood immediately. "No, we don't." She ignored me and looked directly at Helen. "Michael filed for divorce yesterday." Helen's face fell. Despite everything that had happened, hearing those words still hurt her. Vanessa took another step closer. "This is exactly what you wanted, isn't it?" Helen slowly shook her head. "I never wanted your marriage to end." Vanessa laughed bitterly. "Don't lie to me." Several people in the cafe turned toward us. I kept my voice calm. "Vanessa, leave." She didn't even acknowledge me. "You took everything from me," she continued. Her eyes fixed on Helen. "First the house, now my family," Helen quietly answered. "No one took those things from you." For a brief second, Vanessa's composure cracked. If Richard had withdrawn that notice, none of this would have happened. There it was again. Not one word about the shove, not one apology, not 1 ounce of responsibility. Every road still led back to the house. I stepped between them. "This conversation is finished." Vanessa folded her arms. "You think you've won." "This has never been about winning," I replied. "It's been about protecting my wife." Her expression hardened. She leaned slightly toward Helen and said in a voice barely above a whisper, "People who destroy other families eventually lose something, too." Helen instinctively stepped backward. I immediately took out my phone. "I'm calling the police." For the first time, uncertainty crossed Vanessa's face. She looked around and realized several customers had already begun recording the confrontation on their phones. Without another word, she turned, walked quickly to the parking lot, and drove away. The manager came over to ask if we were all right. Helen smiled politely, but her hands were trembling as she picked up her purse. During the drive home, she barely spoke. Halfway back, she quietly admitted, "I don't think she came to talk." "I know," I answered. "She came to see if she could still make you afraid." Helen looked out the passenger window for several seconds before whispering, "It worked." Hearing those 2 words hurt more than I expected. The woman who had stood beside me through 43 years of marriage, financial struggles, illnesses, and loss, now felt unsafe because of someone who should never have been part of our family in the first place. The moment we arrived home, I called Evelyn and described everything that had happened. She listened carefully before interrupting me. "Richard, we're done treating this as a family disagreement." "What are you recommending?" I asked. "A restraining order," she answered without hesitation. "Between the surveillance, the confrontation at the library, and now this, we have a pattern." I looked across the room at Helen sitting silently on the wooden porch swing, not enjoying the evening the way she always had, but simply staring into the yard as though waiting for another car to appear. "Prepare whatever you need," I said. Evelyn paused briefly before replying, "I will. And Richard, keep every message, every sighting, every incident. I have a feeling this story isn't finished yet." Move-out day arrived on a gray Tuesday morning. Rain had started before sunrise and hadn't stopped for hours, covering the city in the kind of silence that only comes with bad weather and difficult decisions. I was already awake when Evelyn called just after 8 was. "It's finished," she said. "Michael signed the final possession documents this morning. The property has been surrendered." I thanked her, ended the call, and sat quietly at the kitchen table. I had imagined this moment many times over the previous month. I expected relief. Instead, all I felt was exhaustion. Helen walked into the kitchen a few minutes later and immediately understood. "They've moved out?" she asked softly. I nodded. She looked down at her coffee without saying another word. Neither of us celebrated. There was nothing to celebrate. A family had fallen apart, and no legal victory could change that. Later that afternoon, Patricia called with an update. "They're staying in a motel on the east side of town," she said. "Michael has Sophie with him this week. Vanessa is staying somewhere else while the divorce moves forward." I closed my eyes for a moment. No father dreams of hearing that his son is living in a motel with his granddaughter, but another thought followed immediately. Michael wasn't there because I had ended the agreement. He was there because for years he had mistaken avoiding difficult choices for solving them. The agreement had only exposed a collapse that had already begun, long before Helen's birthday. Over the next 2 weeks, I heard almost nothing from him. No angry calls, no legal threats, no demands. Then, one Thursday evening, my phone rang. Michael. His voice sounded different the moment I answered. Quieter, slower. "Dad, do you have a minute?" "I do." A long silence followed before he finally spoke. "I used to think losing the house was the worst thing that could happen." I waited. I was wrong. I didn't interrupt. For the first time in months, he wasn't trying to persuade me. He was trying to understand himself. "Sophie asked me yesterday, 'Why are we living in one room?' He said. She wanted to know when we'd go home." His voice cracked slightly. I didn't know what to tell her. I looked out the window toward the wooden porch swing where Helen was quietly reading. "What did you say?" I asked. "The truth," he answered. "I told her grown-ups sometimes make choices they can't undo." Another silence settled between us. Then he surprised me. "Dad, I keep replaying that night." My grip tightened around the phone. "Not just what Vanessa did," he continued. "What I did, I remained silent." He took a slow breath. Mom was standing there holding her shoulder, and I was more worried about keeping the peace than protecting her. Those words carried more weight than every apology I'd heard before. There were no excuses attached. No mention of Vanessa. No mention of the house. Just responsibility. "I spent years believing that staying quiet made me the reasonable one," he said. "Now I realize it only made me part of the problem." I leaned back in my chair, realizing that doesn't erase what happened. "I know," he replied immediately. "I'm not asking you to erase it." We talked for almost 30 minutes. For the first time since this nightmare began, the conversation wasn't about lawyers, contracts, or property. It was about Sophie, about the example he had set for his daughter, about the kind of father he wanted to become before she grew old enough to believe that silence was the same thing as love. When the call ended, I walked outside and sat beside Helen on the porch swing. She looked at me and quietly asked, "How is he?" I thought about everything Michael had just said. Then I answered honestly, "For the first time, I think he's finally stopped blaming everyone else." Helen smiled sadly. "That's a painful place to begin." "Maybe," I replied, "but it's still a beginning." As the rain finally stopped and the evening sky slowly cleared, I realized something important. Losing the house hadn't changed my son. Facing himself had, and sometimes the hardest home a person ever has to rebuild is the one inside their own conscience. 3 weeks after Michael moved out, Evelyn called with news I hadn't expected. "The buyer signed this morning," she said. "The house is officially under contract." I looked at the worn brass key resting on my desk. For 6 years, it had represented possibility. Over the past 2 months, it had become evidence, responsibility, and conflict. Now, it was simply a key again. "Are you sure you want to sell?" Evelyn asked. You could keep it as a rental. I turned the key slowly between my fingers. Every room inside that house reminded me of broken promises, frightened silence, and the moment my son chose comfort over courage. No, I answered quietly. Some places carry too much history to become someone else's future. A week later, we met in Evelyn's office to complete the closing documents. When the final signature dried on the last page, she closed the folder and asked the question everyone had been asking since the sale became public. What would you like to do with the proceeds? I didn't need time to think. I had made the decision long before the property sold. I want every dollar donated. Evelyn looked at me for a moment, surprised but not confused. All of it? Every dollar. I slid a sheet of paper across the desk with a single name written at the top. Claire Benson, Safe Harbor Women's Shelter. Helen had quietly volunteered with Claire's organization for years, helping women who had escaped abusive homes rebuild their lives. During the weeks after her birthday, she told me stories about mothers arriving with children carrying nothing but a few bags and the hope that tomorrow might be safer than yesterday. Looking back, I realized that house had already caused enough pain. If it could now give someone else a chance to begin again, then perhaps something good could finally grow from everything we'd lost. 2 days later, Helen and I visited the shelter together. Claire welcomed us into a modest office filled with photographs of families who had found new beginnings. When I handed her the donation documents, she read the amount twice before looking up. "Mr. Donovan, are you certain?" I smiled. "Completely." Claire's eyes filled with tears. "Do you know how many families this will help?" I shook my head. "No, neither do we," she answered softly. "Because every family's journey is different. But I can promise you one thing. This money will buy more than beds, legal services, or counseling. It will buy time. Time for people to choose safety before fear convinces them to stay." As we walked back toward the parking lot, Helen slipped her hand into mine. "This feels right," she whispered. I nodded. For the first time in months, I felt something I hadn't expected to feel again. Peace. News of the donation spread through the family quickly. That evening, my phone rang. "Michael, Dad, Patricia told me what you did." "She did?" A brief silence followed. "You gave it all away?" "Yes." He let out a slow breath. "A few months ago, I would have thought you were taking something from me." He paused before continuing. "Now, I think you were trying to make sure none of us kept living under the weight of that house." I didn't answer immediately because he was right. The property had become far more than 4 walls and a roof. It had become an excuse, a bargaining chip, and a symbol of everything our family had stopped saying out loud. Selling it didn't erase the past. It simply stopped the past from controlling the future. Michael spoke again, his voice steadier than I'd heard in years. "I'm not calling to ask for anything. I know. I just wanted you to hear this from me." He paused. "You made the harder choice because I wouldn't." I looked through the office window toward the empty hook where the brass key had hung for 6 years. Earlier that afternoon, I'd handed it to Evelyn as part of the closing process. Strange how something so small could carry so much history. "Take care of Sophie," I said quietly. "That's what matters now." "I will," he answered. This time, I actually understand what that means. When the call ended, I realized neither of us had mentioned the house once. For the first time since Helen's birthday, we had spoken as father and son instead of 2 men standing on opposite sides of a contract. That didn't repair everything we had lost, but it was the first conversation that gave me hope we might someday build something more valuable than property. Trust earned the hard way. Months have passed since Helen's birthday, and these days our evenings look remarkably ordinary again. Every sunset, we carry 2 cups of coffee onto the old wooden porch swing and watch the neighborhood settle into silence. For a long time, that swing reminded us of everything our family had lost. Now, it reminds us of something else. Peace isn't something you find. It's something you protect. Helen no longer checks the front window before leaving the house. She laughs more often. She returned to volunteering every week, and Claire tells us the donation has already helped dozens of women and children leave dangerous homes without worrying where they would sleep the following night. Hearing that has given both of us a quiet comfort no courtroom victory ever could. Sometimes the greatest healing comes from knowing your pain became someone else's chance to begin again. Michael's divorce was finalized several months after we sold the house. It wasn't easy and it wasn't clean, but it was necessary. He rented a modest townhouse across town, close enough that Sophie could stay with him every other week without changing schools. The first time Helen and I visited, I noticed something different. The house wasn't large. The furniture didn't match. Half the walls were still bare, but it was calm. Sophie laughed freely without watching the adults' faces first. There were no raised voices, no tension waiting beneath polite conversation. As we prepared to leave that afternoon, Sophie hugged me tightly and whispered, "Daddy smiles more now." Children notice changes adults often miss. That simple sentence told me more than months of legal paperwork ever could. Michael walked us to the driveway after Helen got into the car. We stood together for a moment without speaking. Finally, he reached into his pocket and handed me a folded piece of paper. It wasn't a legal document. It wasn't another request. It was a handwritten letter. "I didn't think I could say this out loud," he admitted. I read it after we returned home. There were no excuses inside. No blame directed toward Vanessa, no complaints about losing the house. He wrote that the hardest part of the past year hadn't been rebuilding his finances. It had been accepting that every time his mother needed him, he had chosen silence because silence felt easier than courage. He thanked me for refusing to rescue him from the consequences of that choice. At the bottom of the page, he wrote one sentence that stayed with me long after I folded the letter. "You didn't choose a house over me. You chose Mom's safety over my excuses." I placed the letter inside the same metal box that had once held the brass key. The key was gone now, but somehow the box felt more valuable than ever. One protected property, the other preserved truth. A few weeks later, Michael asked whether Sophie could spend a weekend with us while he attended a parenting workshop recommended by the family court. I smiled when he told me. The younger version of my son believed asking for help was weakness. The man standing in front of me now understood that learning was part of becoming the father his daughter deserved. People often ask whether I regret the decision I made that night. They expect me to hesitate before answering. I never do. I regret that Helen was hurt. I regret that my son waited so long to face the truth. I regret that Sophie had to watch adults make painful mistakes, but I do not regret choosing my wife. Love without boundaries eventually becomes permission. Forgiveness without accountability eventually becomes surrender. I spent 34 years inspecting buildings, and every unsafe structure taught me the same lesson. Small cracks ignored today become catastrophic failures tomorrow. Families are no different. Sometimes protecting the people you love means making the decision they will hate you for, at least until they understand why you made it. As the sun disappeared beyond the trees that evening, Helen rested her head gently against my shoulder, and together we watched Sophie chasing fireflies across the backyard while Michael laughed beside her. The future wasn't perfect. It never would be, but it was honest. Looking back, I didn't lose a son when I asked him to leave that house. I gave him the one opportunity I could never have given by protecting him from the consequences of his own choices, the chance to become a better man. And if I were forced to make that same decision again tomorrow, knowing every tear, every sleepless night, and every painful consequence that followed, I would still choose my wife every single time.